Hey, everybody. Welcome to another exciting, scintillating, and fantastic episode of the OIG Roundtable. I am your host, Pitbull, and I am here to provide you with music and entertainment for the next 30 minutes. I'm here, of course, with my two partners in crime, Wade McFall, retired assistant special agent in charge and a manager on our SIU investigative team, and Matt Kachansky, retired special agent in charge from the OIG, the retired Northeast UPIC director. And not only is he our payment integrity director, but he's also Pitbull's main roadie for Miami. So we have a great topic today. We want to talk about this case that is getting a ton of press. Amtrak OIG, 119 employees have been charged with the second largest healthcare fraud case in their history. $12 million, $16 million in billed amounts, 12 million in payment. And while we all kind of think that's not really a lot of money in the healthcare fraud sense, it is strictly relating to Amtrak employees. So it does have some pretty strong implications. Keeping in mind that Amtrak is a quasi-governmental organization. And so their OIG operates a little bit differently. They do have both the Amtrak police, which people have probably seen. Those are the uniformed police officers for Amtrak. And Amtrak OIG has an Office of Investigations. So they have special agents that do cases on behalf of Amtrak malfeasance that's identified, FWA and otherwise. They work with the Amtrak police on even conventional crimes. And so this is an interesting one. Because we don't really see a lot from Amtrak OIG in the press. We certainly don't see a lot with respect to healthcare fraud related cases. But this is an interesting one. 119 employees in Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Connecticut, and DC. So kind of that Northeast pocket. And this was a kickback and identity theft case. Where the employees were clearly allowing their insurance to be used for the purposes of billing. And it looks like most of these, if not all these providers, were coming out of the New York area. And so you've got, this issue of employees recruiting other employees and the kickbacks and all that. There was even one instance where it appears that one of the people receiving kickbacks, involved with the payment of the kickbacks, or the receipt of the kickbacks rather, from the doctor. A doctor was threatened by some Amtrak employees for not paying the kickbacks to the employees. So you've got some threats and things of that sort. And so it makes it for an interesting case. And it appears that this case was actually discovered by an agent who was working on healthcare cases and happened to identify this as a problem. And Wade, so I want to start with you, because one of the things that we found when we were doing some of the research in anticipation of today's podcast is in 2018 and 2019, Amtrak's IG through the OIG identified in 2018 and again in 2019 this as a weakness. A program weakness, meaning concentrations of employees going to similar providers, and the prospect that such a concentration could present weaknesses to the program. And it looks like the fraud scheme here is from 2019 to 2022. Now, we don't know for sure. In 2022, why did it end? We don't know for sure, but I can tell you in 2023, several employees pleaded guilty. Starting in 2023. So it's very likely that in 2022 it ended because some people got individualized jewelry and were able to be handcuffed and arrested and all of that. So yeah, that's probably what wound up happening. It wasn't that they just decided to break up the scheme. Most fraud schemes like this are broken up as the result of discovery, for lack of a better term. So Wade, we talk about all the time, data can tell you the story. And obviously the red flag that stands out to me is 119 employees in a concentration of about a half a dozen states in the mid-Atlantic area. And the doctors are all in New York. Why is someone from Delaware going to a doctor in somewhere in New York City? But this is one of those examples where It's a combination of analytics, it's a combination of data, it's also doing some internal sleuthing, right? And looking at the data and seeing, hey, this doesn't look right. But just as important is the OIG identified this in 2018 and 2019. Now we see that this case was 2019 to 2022. So did an investigator look at the OIG report or not? But clearly looking at the work plans when you're in the SIU space and seeing where other things are going is a great way to generate viable leads for investigations. But equally as important is being able to do some basic analytics to see if it doesn't sound right, it probably isn't right.
Right. So a couple things there. One, you talk about the number of employees, 119 employees, and the numbers, according to I think the affidavit, 61 were still employed there, which is a huge problem. 28 had retired, excuse me, and 30 had left, whatever that means. They just moved on to another job, or they didn't retire, but they're no longer there. Now, with a lot of Medicare cases involving kickbacks and receipt of kickbacks, there were times where we considered and wanted to charge Medicare bennies who were receiving kickbacks, but that's just a bad look. They're old people on Medicare. We're not going to charge them, even though they did things illegal like accepting kickbacks, known kickbacks. In this case, we have Amtrak employees, many of which are still employed there, who received kickbacks, usually $1,000, either in cash or various social media. They receive them by Venmo, Apple Pay, PayPal, that type of thing. So, but there's a lot of them are still there. So that's a huge problem. There's no accountability there. If this has been going on for 3-4 years and they were known to be involved 3 or 4 years ago and they're still employees there, there's no accountability, there's no deterrence. So I think that's the first kind of different kind of red flag. But the red flags we're talking about related to the data really has a lot to do with this geographic issue that you're discussing. They're all from 5 or so neighboring states, but all of the providers are in New York. That's something that if they do have data from multiple sources, aggregated data, I think they have a better, I guess, a better opportunity being an IG where they can get aggregated data that should cover everything, as opposed to an SIU, which really doesn't have that access. So they should be able to pull in and use things like we've talked about before, like Click and different programs to do some graphic charting that shows that a lot of these members are driving through, multiple states. And we talked about how if they're going to, for example, an acupuncturist, yeah, they might go to this acupuncturist because they have referrals from other Amtrak employees who say, yeah, this is great. It's really worked for me. So there can be a little bit of that, but you have to look behind that, peel back the layer, and realize that it's more to it than it's just a good acupuncturist or a good massage therapist. They're going there for a monetary reason.
Right. Well, and that's an important part because at the end of the day, what we're not talking about is a situation where 119 employees are going to a particular specialist who happens to be the doctor, right? We're talking about, there was a podiatrist that pleaded guilty. If there's acupuncture in there, it's not like they're all going to the same orthopedic doctor, right? You can make an argument. These are Amtrak employees. They're on their feet 8, 10, 12 hours a day. Is there an argument to be made that they're going to one particular orthopedist where, everybody has had great success in knee replacement or something else, right? Like, and that happens. People travel from all over the world to go to particular hospitals in certain parts of the country because they have a particular condition, right? People travel to New York to go to Sloan Kettering or Texas to go to MD Anderson. They're the best cancer hospitals in the world. If you have cancer, you go to the best place, right? If you have, so it's there's something to be said about that, but it's a little bit on it obviously stinks a little bit. It doesn't necessarily pass the stink test when you're looking and seeing that it's 119 individuals coming from 6 or 7 states, and they're going to, a random, not random, obviously, but, an acupuncturist or a podiatrist. because no matter how good a podiatrist or an acupuncturist you are, are you the best in the world where people from DC need to come to you to get acupuncture, or in the ear or whatever it may be. And that should be the red flag. Like, what is it about that? So it is that becomes the thing. And it's from a data perspective, right? You've got common beneficiary reports. Look at the spend. Look at the spend regionally. When you got common beneficiary reports and you see 119 employees are all going to the same podiatrist in so and so place in New York, that should raise a red flag, right? Because that's going to be an outlier. There should be, from a geospacing or geolocating, it should be an outlier that you see. It looks like actually, this was one of those instances where there wasn't a whistleblower, there wasn't someone. It was the OIG reports in 2018 and 2019 identified a weakness in this area, and then it appears that some investigator took the initiative to start to look at this data. So, Matt, the thing that's interesting about this is when I read this, there was a very large case that went on in the New York area, almost identical, but involved compound drugs, and it involved New Jersey Transit employees and New York City MTA employees. It's actually, I worked on the case a little bit. There wasn't a lot of Medicare involved in this, but what wound up happening was there was a guy who was an employee of New York City Transit Authority, and he drove a bus, an express bus, coach that went from Staten Island to the Port Authority in Manhattan. And when he got to the Port Authority station in Manhattan, there was always downtime. So the bus drivers all get to know each other. The NJ Transit drivers get to know each other. The New York City MTA drivers get to know each other. And he was hooked up with a company that was doing sales and marketing for one of the mail order compounding prescriptions. And he was able to recruit dozens of people, starting with people at the bus station at Port Authority, and then moving on to New Jersey Transit, because what wound up happening was other people that worked for New Jersey Transit started working as recruiters themselves, right? And that's how this network starts. It starts with someone, and then it builds itself out and becomes a pretty pervasive identity theft case involving either people getting prescriptions that they don't need, or they're not getting anything. And in this case, I would really be remiss to think that somebody from DC was traveling up to New York to get acupuncture and then turning around and going back. So, there's likely an incidence of the kickbacks being paid for the use of the theft of the ID, and no services rendered. But this really does go to show you that having good data analytics tools and geolocating and geospacing gets that. But from a management perspective, 119 employees, not including the non-employees that are part of the investigation, the podiatrists, the acupuncturists, any of the doctors. Before you know it, this is going to be a situation where you could have 130 potential subjects in here. And obviously from an SIU perspective, you're not getting so deep into the weeds on the employees and all that, but you're certainly going to be potentially in a position where you're helping to support those investigations. So talk a little bit about how do you manage like where there's that many people, right? You can't just have one investigator. You can't just have one analyst. A little bit of it becomes reprioritization of caseloads, but it also is, how do you manage a large case like this?
Yeah. This one's kind of hitting home to me because the Amtrak IG was my former boss at NASA. So this is sort of a personal one for me. And to look at the management of it, you have, especially if an SIU with limited resources, similar to what the Amtrak IG is, you've got to figure out from the data where's the biggest hit coming from? Who are the providers that are getting the most out of this? Who are the members or the employees that seemingly are getting the most services and therefore maybe the most kickbacks? And then create a project almost of, we've got X number, here are the big hitters, here are the little hitters, and then divide the work amongst a team that's going to be, make this their number one priority, or their seemingly maybe their only focus for a while because it is so large, and then just take it off in bits and bytes. Maybe, you talked about this thing in 18 and 19. Some of the first guilty pleas were in 22. Now in 2025, you're starting to see that it's kind of rolled up to the provider level now. So maybe it was that 3 years they were working this project, working it up from the employees, maybe getting them to cooperate against, and I think they had an undercover in place as well, to do these things. But you've got to take it in bits and bytes and prioritize it based on where the damage is most to the plan. And one of the things I noticed, and just thinking about it, is this is a self-funded health plan. Amtrak is on the hook for all of it. They have, some insurance plans that are administering it, but they don't have a chance for a loss. So they don't have any of that upfront. They're probably not doing a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse detection here. They're probably just paying the claims and being done with it. So you've got, in your 3 levels of program integrity, your first level being the member being your first line of defense, they're involved. So they're not going to be coming to you saying, hey, this is a problem. The second level is usually the plan or the SIU. That doesn't exist here. You've got a plan administrator. They're not looking at the data that an SIU would look at. And the third level then is the employer, which is Amtrak. And it took them a little bit to, and maybe even through happenstance, that this investigator was looking at this data saying, hey, this doesn't look right. And so that's probably why it took so long and got so big before it was detected. And so that, so that's an interesting perspective on this thing. And then once it got big, how do you handle it? And again, it's who are the biggest, who's taking the biggest bites of the apple here, and let's go after them, and then create a strategy on how do we approach this thing to get to all of these players. And maybe that's why it took 3 years. They're just building this case up from the bottom up.
Well, and what's interesting, what you're really talking about is when you have a self-administered plan and a payer in the industry is paying the claims. We're really talking about is what's more commonly known as the TPA, the third-party administrator, right? Mm-hmm. So for those that aren't really familiar with it, and we're kind of on the fringe of our base of knowledge, but basically what happens is when a plan is self-funded like Amtrak, they don't have a network. They're not paying the claims. They're not doing all of that work. So what they do is they contract with an insurance company. And so you're an Amtrak employee and you get your insurance through whatever the plan is. You have an insurance card that says that you're covered by, Blue Cross Blue Shield of whatever, or this plan or that plan. But all they're really doing is processing those claims. And at the end of the day, there's no shared risk. The entirety of the loss is on Amtrak in this case. They're on the hook. It's not a shared risk situation. And what winds up happening is the sponsor, which in this case would be Amtrak, actually dictates back to the plan what they want covered, what they don't want covered, all of that. There was a case that I worked on a few years ago here at Advise involving the New York City Transit Authority and Express Scripts, public record. And there was a case where, New York City Transit Authority self-funded plan, and they used Express Scripts as their pharmacy benefit manager. And they dictated to Express Scripts co-pays, plan limitate, all of that was directed through contractual agreements between the unions and transit authority and all that. So when you're in these situations where there's a TPA in place, they're really doing what the sponsor, in this case, the corporation, wants them to do. And so you normally don't have, Amtrak OIG, a little bit unique. They have special agents who are assigned to do this stuff. But the plans, like for example, a Verizon or an AT&T, which is probably self-funded as well, do they have an internal healthcare benefit integrity team? I've never heard of a situation where they do. They typically are paying or are relying upon the plan that's administering the plan for them to do this. But the question is, to what extent is it being done? And that's where you see, if you're on LinkedIn a lot, you see there are a number of people who work in the TPA space and they tend to talk a lot about how much fraud there is in this sector of healthcare, because it's not policed very well. And while this was only, I mean, I say only a $12 million case, it certainly reflects the fact that it was for a company like Amtrak. This is a large case because of the the kind of that kind of concentration that exists within it. But Matt, just to kind of close the loop on this, we're seeing a lot about instances where attempts are being made to find efficiencies in government through the reduction of costs for FWA. By the way, it's fraud, waste, and abuse. It's not waste, fraud, and abuse. It's fraud, waste, and abuse is kind of the colloquial term. But what we're seeing are these instances where organizations are claiming to find amounts of money through FWA. And what I have said is all you need to do is look at the top 10 unimplemented recommendations that come out from OIGs, where the IGs do this every year. They find this. It's billions of dollars. HHS OIG puts out a yearly list of unimplemented recommendations. And this is one of those where had someone looked at this and implemented it and worked cohesively within their programs, right? So looking at unimplemented recommendations is a way to identify savings. But also from the SIU perspective, and I know we always talk about at HHS OIG, we didn't really look at the work plan because we followed the fraud directly. But SIUs are oftentimes looking for opportunities to find savings. And this is a great example of where had somebody looked at the work plan or a study that they could have found something, right? So there is value in looking at these.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you look at any semi-annual report from an IG, it works through what the work plan is, what studies and audits they've conducted, what ones, found things, what ones haven't been conducted yet, and they outline the biggest vulnerabilities in every department. And they will show that here in their studies, these recommendations were made, and then at the end of the year, they do a report. These were never implemented. And it is in the, I can't imagine, hundreds of billions of dollars of possible savings. This one, $12 million for this. But again, who would be implementing those recommendations? Does it go back to the insurance plan that was, administering this? They don't have a dog in the fight. They're paying the claims. So who would actually implement the recommendations that the IG was making here? It kind of went into probably a black hole. And that's, that's where these things have to be targeted. And SIUs, again, they can look at these and find those vulnerabilities and really make some, good inroads in protecting themselves,
right,
protecting their plans.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting case. For me, it resonated a little bit differently than other cases because the facts that are publicly available were very similar to that very case that I worked involving New Jersey Transit and New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority, MTA, with kickbacks and, concentrations and things of that sort. So, it is an interesting case. 119 defendants, or 119 employees. The crazy part is the fact that, Wade, you brought this up, some of them have retired. Retiring doesn't get you absolved of your criminality. The question is going to be, is there a pitch in the criminality in their retirement on their pensions? And what can you do on their pensions, if anything? The fact that you've got others that just left and we don't know why they left, but clearly, something is afoot and, got to deal with it. But it's going to be interesting to see how this all gets resolved, particularly. And yeah, there is some information, Matt, about there having been an undercover involved where they were having the undercover was signing like logs, like 20 or 30 in advance of them coming and then getting a kickback of payment. So yep, it is going to be interesting to see where this all ends up. Amtrak, we know it's a small IG. They don't have a lot of agents. So it is going to be interesting to see what ultimately happens with this case if there are a large number of trials, 119 employees. I can't imagine that all 119 will plead guilty if all have been indicted or charged. But, you see from some of the roundups that occur during the healthcare strike force cases where you get cases of 20 and 30 defendants. And if you're an investigator, even if you're on the SIU side, you're supporting these cases if you're working on the SIU side, and it is a lot of work. Having been through 9 criminal trials myself, I had 3 criminal trials in 14 months. And if you're not on trial, you're prepping for trial. It is the most stressful time of your life by far, because you're working basically 7 days a week for 14 months. So it is going to be interesting to see from a manpower perspective, person power perspective, how that's all going to gel, because 119 defendants, and having to have trials for that many is going to be a challenge. So I'm looking forward to reading more about it and seeing more what comes up. I'd love to be able to get a little bit more of the backstory on this as we get through this. It will be interesting to see where this all falls, because this is, for Amtrak, this is a big case. And it does really resonate, only because when you get one person in on the hook, how many others fall in, because the kickback money was probably pretty good. I think one of the people that pleaded guilty has to pay over $1 million in restitution. Now that's the value of the benefit conveyed, which is the cost of the service. So there's a lot of money there. I'm sure people got paid a pretty penny for the kickback. So it's interesting to see what happens on this. But this is, I think, a reflection of having an investigator that's diligent, and looking at a few things, and kind of one day just you walk into these things, you're like, holy cow, we have a real case here. So kudos to Amtrak OIG on this one, and we'll continue to see how this goes. So as always, great conversation, good insight from you guys. Appreciate you both giving that, and for everybody that's participating in these LinkedIn lives we do and in our OIG roundtables. Thanks again. Advise, ADVIZE health.com. You can get our newsletter weekly sent to you. So until next time, we'll see you all on the next OIG roundtable. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.